Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Arell, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about a presentation I'm giving, a paper where I'm exploring the possibility of entering into conversation with one another about difficult content, conversing about traumatic content in a way that enables both parties to grow. And I do not think that's an easy thing in any way. But I think it might be valuable for you to think about, especially as you're walking into a holiday time where there are a lot of family gatherings. I think that when the world environment presents us with a variety of both political, social, cultural, religious circumstances, which have a lot of heightened emotions around them or heightened affect, that conversations that we have within the family atmosphere, within friendships, within groups, within classrooms, they can very easily become real tough at the level of emotions. When I'm asked to talk about traumatic global politics, for instance, I think about it in a real particular way in terms of what I am actually skilled at. I utilize a particular theory by David Tracy, where he talks about the difference between, or the two levels of circumstances being like at the microstructural level and at the macro structural level. And the macro would be the social, the cultural, the political, the more systematic things happening. And the microstructures would have to do with what is functioning at the level of the human psyche. So if you watched any of these YouTube videos, that human psyche element is what I'm going towards and where I explore. I don't disregard the political or cultural element, but in terms of thinking about dealing and talking about conflict, where my concern lies as a researcher is in the experience of the human individual. Now, in terms of what's happened both within the election and related to the global conflicts and the violence in the world right now, when I have people who come talk to me or ask me to speak at any conference, for instance, my focus is to think about the individual psychic level. And I want to say, there's no real perfect way to package that. So what I want to offer is for you to think about how traumatic content, whatever it is for you, and that means something that triggers an emotional response that what we would call at the psychological level hyper-regulated. So you get irritated, angry, upset. There are mechanisms that happen in your body that actually disenable you from thinking clearly when that happens. And so if there is that dynamic, the ability to have a reflective, calm, thought-provoking, and even opportunity to gain new insights in any given conversation is undermined. One of the priorities then become, if we think about it this way, in terms of talking to one another, to try to regulate ourselves. So let me explain that a little more particularly. Our brains are wired to sense, address, notice, and respond to danger. We are made like that. If we live like that, the level of stress on our system is pretty insurmountable. If we have a trauma history, our bodies are really, really set up to be always looking for any potential threat. That's one scenario in terms of being vulnerable to high-level affect in the confrontation with conflict or traumatic content. If we are of any population that has in its imagination, as a social group or as a cultural group, the fear of extinction, meaning that my people won't be around anymore, there's some threat to my family, social group, etc., that's another instance that's going to elevate this response to potential threat, especially from another person or from the group that we consider as oppositional. If we have the experience of having some great loss or are economically disenfranchised and are having struggles related to that, we don't sleep enough, physiologically or psychologically have anything that's debilitating, that's also going to set us up for the being on the lookout mode. All of these things, all of these positions create vulnerability. Now, everybody's vulnerable if they don't have these circumstances, which most people have one of those, but if you don't have these circumstances, you're still vulnerable to having difficulty with conversations that include confronting conflict and might be triggered by that. Okay, what happens then? Your body says, okay, whatever person A or people B are presenting to me poses some kind of threat. Even if it's not perceived through your mind, your body is recognizing it as troublesome, right? Insulting or damaging, maybe not even to yourself, maybe to someone else. There's still a trigger there, right? What happens is your cortisol rises, your adrenaline rises, the blood from your heart starts to go really quickly to your hands and feet. That's actually a physiological response to prepare you to fight. And this is all very basic from your most basic part of your brain, which means the part that comes first, that links us to animals. And a muscle in the front of your hip contracts to put you either in fight mode, flight mode, meaning you have to get out of the circumstance. How many of you guys have had something come up where you're just like, oh my God, I gotta get out of here now? Or freeze. Oh my God, I can't say anything. Oh my God, I gotta be quiet. Now, I'm not making a judgment on any of those responses because depending on the level of the trigger, depending on where you are in your life at any given moment, depending on the stakes of the conversation, you may choose to do one of those things in order to maintain equilibrium or safety for yourself. That I feel like has to come from the inside of your soul. In the case that any of those happen, heart rate increase, the blood goes to your limbs, the front of your hips contracts a little bit, get tense in your upper neck, right? That is the reptilian, that basic part of your brain speaking to the rest of you and telling the, what would we call the prefrontal cortex, your thinking brain, to stop, to shut down. In the instance that the emotional affective surge that creates all these physiological responses, or which work together with these physiological responses, is pretty high, which we would call dysregulated, your learning potential will be decreased. The ability to manage emotions becomes decreased. Your ability to think clearly, to plan, to strategize, to understand, all of those are undermined. If you start to feel or recognize any of what I'm saying in conversation with someone else, you will also notice that it might be hard to form words, regardless of if you're in fight, flight, or freeze. And not everybody would go into those, but if you find yourself there, you will find the language formation becomes slightly difficult. And then another effect of that would be that you can't quite think clearly. It becomes a rush in your mind, right? Like thoughts are everywhere. They're not cohesive or logical. Not that they have to be logical, but you'll notice that it becomes difficult to connect to that because the feelings, the affects are so large. So what do we do about that? One strategy actually that I used to use, which I don't use it anymore because I understand pretty deeply what's happening to me when my higher level thought processes are interfered with. And I just have to say that I don't care how old you are or how much you know, what I just described happens to all of us. The more practice you have at like breath regulation, which is one way to kind of help this process be diminished and increase the effectiveness of any potential conflictual conversation that you might have. I think breath regulation, like I just said, is one real helpful mechanism. It immediately will trigger a vagal nerve response, which will lower the heart rate. It might take a few breaths, but that's effective. And the other strategy that I was saying that I used to do, which I don't do anymore, is pretending as if I'm a reporter. And I try to envision myself outside of any given situation and kind of watch what's happening, because that little removal enables me to take a more objective stance on what's happening and maybe slow it down a little bit. I think that one way that we can help, not maybe within the situation that's ensuing, but outside of it, is to do quite a bit of self-reflection about what our own fears are. Because when I think we get these affective charges, when we have a physiological response to a perceived threat, that we actually are experiencing a threat. And it may not necessarily be from the direct conversation, but have legs or roots behind us, right? Or beneath us, as it were. So doing some self-reflection about your own upset around any given political situation or around the election, like what it is that you're afraid of, what are you guarding close to your heart, and really understanding that, because when it becomes lit up, so to speak, it might be easier to stay balanced in this cognitive realm. It becomes pretty difficult to think clearly and to have reasonable conversations, if that's what we want to label them. And when you know that, it's a little bit easier to navigate, because people aren't necessarily talking from their highest adult learned selves. They can't physiologically. You can't sometimes. I can't sometimes. From a theoretical level, which also has practical components, the way that I've been working with this is to think about a concept called the wounded healer. If we assume when we care about other people's wounding, it's generally has some connection to our own woundedness. And if we understand our woundedness, then we are capable of being with someone more empathetically. This is a skill that takes time to hone, and it also requires that we do quite a bit of self-reflection, as I mentioned, self-care, which not self-care in its more kitschy considerations, but more self-care as deep self-love. So what is it that we need? What is it we need to stay regulated, for instance? For me, it's looking or being near water. That immediately will like calm my whole nervous system down. And that's what I mean by regulated. You have a very nice, calm, steady nervous system. And the third thing maybe to hone in on, and maybe it's more than three, is to think about boundaries. I think boundaries are really important. Where you're willing to go, and to know this beforehand, and when it's time to pull back a little bit. But also, if you're trying to help someone get to an opinion, get to a certain state of being, that you don't project yourself onto them. I hope some of this is helpful for thinking about how to talk to others. I'm working through it myself, and I think about it mostly in the context of my classes, where I'm a little better at it, actually, I think, than perhaps in my personal life, because I have to enter a classroom with a certain responsibility to my students that kind of sheds itself a little bit when I'm in my personal life. Good luck.